Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julia Janae. Thank you for being with us this afternoon as we track a very big case that is happening out in the state of Texas. A high school track meet ended in a 17-year-old's death, and now the trial is getting national attention. People are divided, talking about race and self-defense, and today we are following day one of Karmelo Anthony's murder trial happening out there in McKinney. And inside of that courtroom now, they have taken a break. We've been following those live notes all day, and we're going to check in with Cody Thomas in just a moment. But where we're at right now is after the first witness was called by the state, a forensic video analyst was the one who was testifying to multiple wide-angled surveillance videos that the prosecution admitted was not crystal clear. But while playing that video, there was some reaction in the gallery. Now, cameras are not allowed inside of this courtroom, but they're on the ground in Frisco. We have our own Cody Thomas, who is following everything that's happening. Let's take a look back. Even though we don't have those cameras, we do have the defense attorney, Mike Howard, what he said before the gag order was put in place in this case.
We expect that when the full story is heard, the prosecution will not be able to rule out the reasonable doubt that Karmelo Anthony may have acted in self-defense. Self-defense is a fundamental right guaranteed every American. The law is clear. When self-defense is raised by the facts, the law puts the burden squarely on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the citizen accused did not act in self-defense. The law does not expect or require the citizen accused to prove that they acted in self-defense. It's actually the opposite. The law requires the prosecution to rule out the reasonable doubt that the citizen accused may have acted in self-defense.
And let's go right now to someone who was inside of that courtroom listening to these opening statements. No cameras, but we have our eyes and ears inside of the courtroom. Cody Thomas joins us now live outside of the courthouse in McKinney, Texas. Cody, good to see you. Tell me about those opening statements. First of all, what was it like being inside of the courthouse for those?
Well, yeah, Julia, as we know this judge is really laying down the law inside that courtroom, being very strict on how people go to and from the courtroom, and about, us as media using electronics. He even admonished members of the gallery for whispering to each other, saying if he caught somebody whispering again, I didn't see anybody whispering, but, he just said if he saw that again, they'd keep them out. He kicked them out permanently. But Julia, to touch on those opening statements, of course, the prosecution is continuing the narrative that we've heard from the beginning since April of 2025, that Karmelo Anthony was under that tent for no good reason. He was just there, and then Austin Metcalf and his friends came up to approach him to say, get out from under the tent, to which Karmelo Anthony, the prosecution says, got aggressive, reached in that bag, pulled out a knife, and stabbed Austin Metcalf. But the defense in their opening statements painted a different picture. They began by humanizing Karmelo Anthony, talking about how he had 2 jobs in high school, how he was, a brother, a son, an oldest brother, how he was a 3.7 GPA A student in school, just really painting him out to be a good human being before diving into their version of the facts of the case. Now, of course, we've heard that statement from eyewitnesses, or a witness on the stand, or not on the stand, in the area, saying that Karmelo reached into the bag saying, touch me if you want to, or see what happens if you touch me. And that's what led, when Austin pushed him, he stabbed him in the chest. But the defense attorney says it was more of a, as long as you don't touch me, we'll be cool, implying that, everything's fine. I understand there's a verbal altercation going on here, but just don't put your hands on me. So that was the narrative the defense painted there. They also said that Karmelo was under the tent because he was seeing somebody he was familiar with, a friend of his still girlfriend now, somebody he'd been acquainted with, somebody he recognized. And then they walked through some of that video, Julia, showing that Karmelo Anthony was under the tent for about 2 minutes before Metcalf, his twin brother, and their friends got to the tent, and the whole ordeal went down in about 4.5 minutes of both parties being under that tent, Julia. But again, emotional out here. I'm looking around it here. There's a lot more demonstrators than there were yesterday during jury selection. So, each side is here. It's a polarizing case, of course, that has caught many headlines across this country. But those opening statements were definitely powerful on either side.
Notes, Cody. We're so fortunate that you've been able to share with us what is happening inside of that courtroom. Tell us more about the surveillance video, because your notes on this were very interesting. What were you able to see? And then I also understand there was a reaction from the victim's family when that was being played.
Yeah, Julia. So that's in the opening statement. They were referencing surveillance video, and of course, everyone wanted to see video. We haven't seen anything. There's been a gag order on this case since the very beginning last year. So they start playing this video. There were 5 different angles of the video getting walked through from testimony by the forensic video analyst. And they were very wide-angle videos, Julia, and the witness had to talk about how he had to use this software to zoom in and try to make the video as clear as possible. And even then, Julia, I won't lie, it still looked very fuzzy and hazy. It definitely sets the scene. You can see what's going on, but even the prosecution distinctly said that you won't be able to uniquely identify anyone, but they referred to Karmelo on the video as the person of interest, and they referred to Austin Metcalf as the victim. Of course, as the forensic analyst has digested this video and dissected it and pointed out everything that we need to know, going through shoes and the type of clothing they were wearing. So we identified who each person was in the video, even though they kind of just looked like humanoid blobs. But you see, one thing that stood out to me, Julia, is that, I'm very familiar with track meets. I was under the impression that when you go to a championship track meet, you have multiple tents on the same side of the bleachers. But in this video, because it's early in the morning, just before 10 a.m. when all this happened, the high school where all this went down, Memorial High School, it was just an isolated tent in the bleachers by itself. There were no surrounding, schools or anything in the general area. You saw some schools walking in, but I guess, the meet was just starting. But anyway, they identified Karmelo walking up the bleachers, kind of walking towards the tent. He kind of goes towards someone, and you see him standing there for a couple of minutes. Then you see Austin Metcalf, his twin brother, and his friends walking up and getting under the tent. And then once everything's happening under the tent, it just kind of looks like a blob of people. You can't really make out anything that's really going on for 5 to 6 minutes. And then you see a quick to and from, and they were implying that was like the push, the initial contact. You can't really see anything happening before then. You see people walking by. They're not really, turning heads as if something's loud and, something's catching their attention. But all of a sudden you see that to and from, and then you see Karmelo, or who they identify as person of interest, who we're assuming to be Karmelo Anthony. He runs out from under the tent, and then he's running down the bleachers, sprinting a ways away from the tent and out of the stadium onto the track and everything towards one of his coaches. And eventually after that, we see another angle of the video where Karmelo's been taken into custody by police. But the reaction, Julia, it wasn't a visceral reaction. When you saw the to and from, of course, that's the stabbing action, if you will. All I saw, I'm sitting 2 rows behind Austin Metcalf's father, and his head was just kind of in his hands, kind of like this. Wasn't necessarily crying, but, just implying that he doesn't really want to see, even though you can't see the stabbing, but he knows in his mind this is the moment that his son lost his life. So he was just there, obviously overwhelmed by everything. I'm sitting right behind the Metcalf family. Karmelo Anthony's family is on the opposite side of the courtroom. But again, the video, not as impactful as I thought, but it definitely is a scene setter to help us understand clearer as to what's going on, since we haven't seen anything so far in this case.
Oh, incredible detail, Cody. You're setting the scene for us. Not being able to see what's going on in this case that has so many eyes on it is really helpful. You also broke some news for us earlier when it came to the jury. There have been a lot of questions about who's on this jury, what may be their demographics, how will that impact a case that has had a lot of polarization racially, especially online, even though we know these parties say, even the prosecution today in the opening saying this is not about race. But what have you observed about the racial makeup of this jury?
Yeah, Julia. So, of course, this, with the optics of this case, this story here, young black kid, young white kid, violent crime. Of course, people are going to have their opinions. They're going to have their judgments. And, the jury was, that the makeup of the jury was in question. And so, of course, I was in jury selection yesterday, and that jury was seated around just after 5 p.m. yesterday. And I couldn't necessarily see the courtroom today. We saw reports last night that there was no African-American people on the jury, and that held to be true. It's a majority white jury, of course, made up of men and women. There are 3 Asian women on the jury. One what looked to be a Middle Eastern woman on the jury, and another person of darker complexion on the jury, but none of them were African-American. There's a total of 12 jurors, 6 alternates, so a total of 18, I guess I should say. But yeah, majority white jury. All the men are white as well. So the reports were true. No African-American people on this jury. I remember yesterday during jury selection, the defense raised an objection to the prosecution's strikes. In the strike zone, there were 3 black female jurors that the prosecution wanted to strike, and that would have been all the African-American jurors that were available at the time. And the prosecution says they did not strike them on a racial basis, but on an occupational basis, because they were all educators, and they thought that would hold some sort of bias because all of this went down at a school. But the defense's objection was eventually denied by the judge, and the judge, granted the strikes on behalf of the prosecution. So those are the only three available African-American jurors at the time, right before the jury got seated. That objection got denied about 15 minutes before it was seated yesterday. So majority white jury, 3 Asian women and 2 women of color, but no African-Americans at all.
And the judge saying that there were race-neutral reasons for the strikes of the African-Americans in that pool. Cody, Thomas, thank you for all of those details. I know you've got to get back inside of that courtroom and grab some lunch before you get back. So we will see you later on. There's no escaping how polarizing this trial is. Both Karmelo's mother and Austin Metcalf's father have spoken about the emotional toll here. And joining me now is someone who knows really better than anyone about a trial being this polarizing. He's an attorney who successfully defended George Zimmerman, who was accused of murdering Trayvon Martin. And that was a case that had issues of race and self-defense. It defined that trial as well. We have with us Mark O'Mara. Mark, it is so good to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me. I think you're an important voice here because whether you see it this way or not, there are many people online, people who are reacting to this case, and it often seems this way whenever we have a case where 2 different parties are of different races. You have a self-defense allegation and one is unarmed, the victim. There's often a reference to the Trayvon Martin case, the George Zimmerman case. Sure. I want to ask your opinion. Do you see similarities here in this case?
Oh, no, there definitely are. It is undeniable. And we can't and really shouldn't even deny the harsh reality that race interposes itself on most criminal trials. It imposes itself on the criminal justice system as a whole. And it does so here in this case, only because they are of different races. Now, I'm not saying that Karmelo had any racial intent in his actions, but we as the observers, right, as the viewers of it, look at this and say, oh, obviously there's a racial component. There may have been nothing in either one of their minds the day that this happened, this tragedy occurred. But we look at it as lawyers and as commentators and say we have to be aware of it because we know, and I've argued for decades, that there's an undeniable bias existing in the criminal justice system against young black males. Used to be we could never even talk about it 20 years ago or so. Finally, we can talk about that undeniable bias, but it's there. And I would tell you, I'm very concerned that there is not an African American on this panel, and more concerned that the state was able to cross out 3 African American females that were opposed on what we do call a Batson strike because of a concern of a racial striking. And that's a problem for this trial, and we haven't even started yet.
Yeah, that's been concerning to a lot of people who are reacting to this. I'm curious what the breakdown was in that landmark trial that you successfully represented George Zimmerman, if you remember. Was it similar? There are other cases. The Ahmaud Arbery one stands out to me where there was a question of that jury. There was only one African American on that one down in Brunswick, Georgia. What do you think that has, if it has an impact at all on how the outcome may be in this case, and will they have a successful appeal if there's a conviction?
Well, again, my jury was 6 women, only one who was identified as maybe biracial, but no African Americans on my jury. I am very concerned, as I mentioned a moment ago, about the fact that we now go into this trial with a racial component not only existing as it did before jury selection, but now I think exaggerated or exacerbated because now 12 non-African Americans are going to decide this kid's fate. And just as we had to deal with in the Zimmerman case, you want to have something that people can place their trust in the verdict, whatever it is. And I was sort of hopeful in the Zimmerman case that since all the evidence came out, all the arguments came out, that it would at least be understood, but it was still difficult to trust. When you go into a case like this with the undeniable racial concern and do it with a jury that has no African Americans, not only do you build in a possible appellate issue, but you really build in a social issue that how is a black community going to look at this if he gets convicted and say this is a just verdict? They're going to look at it the way they've had to for decades, which is it's a biased system. Here's an example of it.
Oh, wow. Really great insight, Mark. We have to get a break, but you're going to stick around a little longer. We have a lot we're going to talk about on this case. Coming up, we're going to look at the facts of the case, also what we learned from opening statements, but we're going back to the initial report. What did those witnesses on the scene, including the defendant, say to officers right after this stabbing?